The first 28 days after birth are called the neonatal period, and natal refers to birth, and neo means new, and literally means like newborn, right? And at this point, the baby can do almost nothing for itself. It is completely dependent on the mother for nourishment, transportation, protection, and I've sometimes heard the first few months even of life called the fourth trimester because the babies are so underdeveloped compared to some other organisms, right? Like a horse is walking within moments, that it's almost like they're still in the womb. Since the end of the second trimester, the mom has been producing colostrum, which is that first milk that is going to support the baby. And it's different from, they say your milk comes in after a couple of days. That's the milk that you'll have going forward. This colostrum is different. It has a lot of antibodies to fight infection. It's much, much higher in fat content, get the baby's weight up. And it also has lysozymes, which are antibiotic enzymes to help protect the baby. That colostrum also helps a baby start pooping pretty quickly, which is important so that they get that tarry first poo that's called meconium out. That can help them, especially if they find that they're jaundiced. And then after the first few days, the regular milk kind of comes in. And that first 28 days is the neonatal period again, and the rest of the first year is called infancy. So technically, the child is an infant for a year. They're still pretty dependent on the mother. And after that, we consider them a child. After a year or so, you start, you might be walking or getting close to it. You may start talking a little bit, showing a little bit more independence. Might be weaned from breast milk at some point early in childhood. And the body proportions begin to change. Babies have very big heads compared to the rest of their bodies, and in childhood, the rest of your body sort of catches up. The beginning of puberty brings adolescence, and this is the time at which your body is becoming sexually mature. And when you become sexually mature and your growth is complete, which usually happens a little bit earlier for females, a little bit later for males, sometimes males grow into their 20s. I am still waiting for my last growth spurt. You hit maturity, and at maturity, you are finished developing. You will still undergo some changes, but that is just aging or senescence. There are a lot of changes that occur at puberty, and most of them are a result, at least on some level, of the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, but they're enhanced by some other hormones, growth hormone, thyroid hormones, prolactin, adrenocortical hormones. And to close the loop, it all starts with what we talked about at the very beginning of this course in chapter 16, with the hypothalamus of the endocrine system producing gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which targets the anterior pituitary and causes it to release its gonadotropins, which are luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Those, in turn, because they're gonadotropins, will target the gonads, and they will cause gamete production and production of sex hormones, which have their own set of effects. In males, these hormones will cause your integumentary system to grow. Not only is it getting bigger, but you're getting hair that's different and you're growing it in different places. You're also kicking those oil glands into gear. I don't know about you, but I had some pretty awful acne at that age. Your skeletal and muscular systems are impacted. You grow, right? You grow a lot. You get taller. Your muscles get bigger, right? They do start to thicken up. Your respiratory system changes not only to bring in more oxygen for that growth, but also that voice change. Your heart has to grow in response to that. Your brain begins to change, and it doesn't finish developing until you are in your early 20s. And the last parts to develop are the decision-making inhibition centers in your prefrontal cortex. And obviously your reproductive system is also developing. That's sort of the whole point of all of this. Many of the same things are happening in the female reproductive system, right? You are growing hair in places you didn't have it before, not necessarily a beard, but axial hair and hair in the around the reproductive structures. You're also growing and your muscles are getting stronger, if not quite as much so as in males typically. Your nervous system, your brain is changing, your cardiovascular system is changing. Your voice also changes. Women's voices change, just not to quite the degree that male voices change. And then all those reproductive structures that we talked about last chapter are beginning to come online. To understand how this all works, it helps to understand inheritance. And we've understood inheritance as humans for a long time. You know that, you have your grandma's nose in your dad's eyes or whatever. But we've only known for a while that the genes are the reason for this. And the study of those mechanisms of inheritance is called genetics. Every one of your cells has two sets of chromosomes because they're diploid, one from your mom and one from your dad. And the set of genes that you have for a particular trait is called your genotype. The phenotype is the actual physical or physiological trait that you display. So, I may get 2 genes for hair color from my mom and my dad, right? The genes I have are my genotype. The actual color hair I wind up with is phenotype. And that has to do with the genes and their interaction. It also has to do with the interaction of my genes and the environment. And epigenetics are extra genetic influences that impact how your DNA is read by your cells and how it produces a phenotype. Another way to think of it is that a genotype is like the set of plans that the architect draws up for your house, and you can use those plans over and over again, and the phenotype is what the house ends up looking like. Houses with the same plans are probably going to look a lot alike, but depending on the construction workers that build it and what it goes through during the construction process, it could look a little bit different from another house with the same plans. If you take those 46 chromosomes in your cells, or 23 pairs, right, because you've got 2 sets of all of those chromosomes, and you lay them out next to one another, that's called a karyotype, right? And so you have 2 sets of each chromosome, one from your mom and one from your dad. Together they are called homologous chromosomes. 22 of them are considered autosomal chromosomes. They're just your typical old chromosomes. And the last pair are called sex chromosomes, and they're different because your autosomal chromosomes all look essentially alike. They might have some small details, like which version of which gene is on there might be different. You may have a brown eye color gene on one and a blue eye color gene on the other, but you're going to have eye color genes on both, right? Whereas sex chromosomes are entirely different. You may have 2 X chromosomes, but if you're male, you could have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. And this is what a karyotype looks like. So each of these are different chromosome number 1. Each of these are different chromosome number 9. You can see that they're essentially the same, even if they might be slightly different. They have the same types of genes on there. Whereas X and Y look entirely different. Y is very, very small, doesn't have very many genes on it at all. So this is your karyotype. And from looking at the karyotype, you can tell some things. For instance, you can tell the genetic sex of this individual. You can also tell if there are some other chromosomal abnormalities, like an extra chromosome, or if you're missing a chromosome, things like that. So every chromosome has a set of genes on it, a set of instructions for things it codes for. And you have 2 of each of your chromosomes, right? One set from mom and one set from dad. And your chromosome 8 from mom and your chromosome 8 from dad have essentially the same instructions. They code for the same sets of things. Now, they may have slightly different instructions for those things, but they have the same sets of instructions. So again, they might have genes that code for hanging earlobes from mom and attached earlobes from dad, but the earlobe gene is going to be on the same chromosome. And we call these homologous chromosomes, the ones that are the same. And if you have 2 sets of the same version of the gene from mom and dad, so if you have 2 hangy genes, you are considered homozygous. If you have a hangy from mom and an attached earlobe from dad gene, you are considered heterozygous. That literally means different alleles. And we'll talk about how those interact with one another shortly. Here's a look at 2 homologous chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. And here's a gene up here that you are homozygous for. Here's a gene down here that you are heterozygous for. You have different alleles or different versions of that gene. So again, you might have an eye color gene, right? These both code for eye color, but they're for different eye colors, different versions of that eye color gene. If you are homozygous, meaning you got the same version of the gene from your mom and your dad, it's pretty obvious what your phenotype is going to be. So if your genotype is you got a brown hair allele from mom and a brown hair allele from dad, you're probably going to have a brown hair phenotype. But when you're heterozygous, it gets trickier. If you get a brown hair allele from mom and a blonde hair allele from dad, you're heterozygous. What's your phenotype going to be? Well, it depends on those alleles and how they interact. A lot of them have strict dominance, which means that one of those alleles is dominant over the other. And for instance, if brown is dominant over blonde, then if you are heterozygous, you're going to have brown hair, just like if you would have had two brown alleles. So one dominant, one recessive allele. In this instance, we've got a kid who has red hair. Well, red is a recessive trait. So in order to have this red hair phenotype, he must have had two recessive alleles, two red hair alleles. Freckles is a dominant phenotype. So he may be homozygous for freckles, or he may be heterozygous, freckles and non-freckles. You can't tell. Both of them will give the same phenotype of having freckles, because the freckles gene is dominant over the non-freckles gene. Well, how can you predict, based on two parents, if you know their genotypes, how can you predict what offspring of those two individuals might look like? Well, you can do it using a Punnett square, and you set up these alleles using letters, usually capital letters for dominant traits, lowercase letters for recessive traits. You can be homozygous, dominant, or recessive, or you can be heterozygous, where you have one of each. And setting up these Punnett squares essentially lets you compare. All right, so if mom is, let's say, homozygous, right? She has two little a's for this particular allele. Well, no, every one of her eggs is going to have a little a. But if dad is heterozygous, during meiosis, when those chromosomes come apart, because the sperm is only haploid, right? Only has one set of chromosomes, not two. Half the sperm are going to get the big A, half are going to get the little a. So essentially, when you set up these Punnett squares, you're saying, well, what if a big A sperm from dad happens to meet a little a sperm from mom, right? Well, what if a little a sperm from dad happens to meet a little a sperm, or little a egg, I should say, from mom? And then you do that again over here, right? In this case, mom's eggs are all little a, so it's, this is going to look the same as this. But that helps you game out what the possible offspring genotypes could look like. In this case, half of the offspring are going to be heterozygous, with big A from dad's sperm and little a from mom's egg. Half are going to be homozygous recessive, with little a from dad's sperm and a little a from mom's eggs. When traits are decided by a single gene, your Punnett square can predict the phenotype. But a lot of traits, in fact, probably most, are polygenic, which means more than one gene will impact that single phenotype. So hair color is actually like that. Brown or black hair color or blonde, it's a result of multiple genes that can all influence the pigment deposition in your hair. And we know this because there are different colors of hair that are not just brown, black, or blonde, or red, right? There are lots of things in between, right? We'd probably consider both these guys to have brownish hair, but this is really dark brown, this is a little bit lighter brown, etc., etc. Even when it's a single gene, sometimes it's not as simple as we made it sound. Not everything has strict dominance-recessive relationships. Sometimes you have codominance, where both alleles are expressed when you're heterozygous. For instance, if you have two alleles for type A blood, you have type A blood phenotype. If you have two alleles for type B blood, for the B antigen, you'll be type B blood. But if you have an allele for the A antigen from mom and an allele from the B antigen from dad, you will be type AB. Both of those alleles are expressed. That's codominance. And also a lot of these have polygenic inheritance. Sometimes instead of codominance, you have something called incomplete dominance, where instead of both alleles being expressed, you get something in between. So if you have a red allele and a white allele, you get pink. So codominance would be both red and white splotches. Incomplete dominance is pink. It's a new intermediate phenotype. And lastly, if the gene happens to be on the sex chromosomes, it's a whole different complication, because males have a Y chromosome and only one X chromosome, whereas females have two X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. So if a gene is on a Y chromosome, females will never have it. Now that's rare because the Y chromosome is pretty small. But if it's on the X chromosome and it's recessive, females can have one recessive gene on one of their X chromosomes and the dominant on the other and still have the dominant phenotype, right? So if it's a recessive disease, they're less likely to display it as phenotype. Whereas males, if they get a diseased gene on their X chromosome, they have no second X chromosome to mask it with a dominant normal gene. And so even if it's a disease that's recessive and is on the X chromosome, males are still more likely to display it than females. So one example of this is color blindness. Here you can see the colorblind allele. This is a diseased colorblind allele on the X chromosome, and a male doesn't have another X chromosome to have a healthy allele on it to mask this.